Welcome, fellow druids, to another episode of Full Circle in my Identity series. So, I recommend that you watch these somewhat in order, and the one that is labeled beginning in Mark 1 will give you the breakdown of what I'm attempting to do here. So I definitely recommend that you watch that one, and then you don't necessarily have to watch all these in order, but I think it'll probably, I'm building on them as I go. So go back and watch that one if you haven't, and that will give you an idea what we're talking about. So, but as we continue our journey of trying to find Circle's identity, we talked about Mark 1 in the last episode, and now we're going to talk about Mark 2 and how Circle evolved from Mark 1 to Mark 2, and how Mark 2 evolved for us as well. And again, I said some of this in the first episode, but keep in mind, a lot of this is my experience, and a lot of this is I'm looking at the big picture, what the Circle community was saying and what most tournaments were showing and things like that. I realized that it doesn't necessarily, like, my experience and those experiences may not necessarily be every personal, like every individual's exact experiences, and that's okay. You might have had like a pet model or unit in Mark 2 that you thought in Mark 2 was great and changed, or maybe even in Mark 1 you thought it was great, then it was terrible in Mark 2 you felt like, and maybe it's back where you wanted, or you get the idea. So we're going to explore, and I have a lot more knowledge of Mark 2 because I actually started playing in Mark 2 and pretty early in Mark 2. I joined the game in Domination, or right around Domination. So I'm going to talk about how those things evolved. So with the release of the Circle, the first things that released in Mark 2 was Primal Mark 2 and the Forces of Circle book. Every faction got a Forces book, if you're not familiar. Much like the Command books in Mark 3, if you're just joining us from a Mark 3 perspective. As I understand, that was actually kind of a big deal because prior to that, everything was anthology-based, and sort of because that was the anti-GW model, and this like doing a faction book felt very codex-like to some people, and one of the things that everybody just loses their mind about is that Privateer cannot do anything at all like GW. Anyways, that's a whole nother ball of worms, can of worms, that we're not going to open. Or at least not any further than I just did. So anyway, those books release on a lot. Circle's identity starts to change then, right? So a lot of casters are changed from Mark 1. We get, right off the bat with Forces, we get Cassius, who's now actually Wormwood. We get Cassius and Wormwood, but things flip in Mark 3. We'll talk about that later. So we get a new Warlock. We get things like the Shifting Stone UA, which didn't exist prior to that. We get the Warpwolf Stalker. We get the Wold Guardian. We get the Druid Wilder came out at this time. The Skinwalkers come out around then. The Reeves... no, I think the Reeve UA came out in Mark 1. The Reeve Hunter Solo comes out at that time. At some point, the Tharn Ravager... Shaman becomes a weapon attachment for the Ravagers, and the Tharn Ravager Chieftain is released. The Tharn Ravager White Man, I think, came out in Mark 1. He evolves in this process. Blackcloud Wayfarer evolves, the Druids evolve. I believe the Stoneward and Woldstalkers were in Mark 1, which I didn't mention in the last episode, so they come out in this, you know, they're revamped. All these things, so all these old things they're trying to bring up into the new rule set, and they add a bunch of things. And this is not unique to Circle, of course. Every faction got a bunch of things. And a lot of factions changed right at this point. Like, this was a big difference, right? Before this, you had Warpwolf, and you had the Alpha Warpwolf, which was the Pureblood. Every faction had those. They went away from that idea. Some of them maintained some leadership abilities, but they largely just sort of like started to... They were just Warpwolf. They were just War Beasts at that point. So we start out the edition with that, and that is one of the big... The Warpwolf Stalker, and honestly the Stonekeeper Solo, or sorry, unit attachment for the Shifting Stones, probably are the two things which fundamentally, to the best of my knowledge, change what Circle is. Being able to put the ability to sprint on any model in any list that you played completely changed how people looked at this faction. In fact, I would say no faction was as heavily influenced by one model as Circle Orboros was. The Warpwolves, in many regards, you could say that Mark II Circle was completely identified by the Warpwolf Stalker. This is my experience. This is tournament experiences, and like probably the most common cited thing when I ask people today what they felt like was affecting or negatively affecting what they thought of as identity was the change, and we'll talk about what changed in a different episode, but the Lightning Strike and the Warpwolf Stalker come up so many times when I bring up the topic of identity that it is that critical. And I think that there's a lot of importance to that, right? Like all of a sudden having a faction where any given piece, and we have War Beasts we do have some in the speed 4-5 range, but those were mostly the Wolves. But largely we had things that were speed 6+. Our caster, our Warlocks, the Warpwolf Stalker himself, the other War Beasts, something like a Feral Warpwolf who could go to speed 8, being able to sprint was massive. And I'll talk about a few things you could do with that. Getorix, eventually when he came out, I know we haven't gotten that far, but like Getorix comes out, things like that. Any piece could have Lightning Strike on it at any time. And then, of course, the Shifting Stone UA I bring up because a lot of what people played in Mark II, and I didn't really hear a lot about this, about the Shifting Stone placements in Mark I, so I'm going to assume that they weren't seen as... They didn't leave an imprint in people's mind from who I asked as much. Obviously, you know, I'm sure somebody will chime in and say different, and that's great. But that's what I was finding. So Mark II, though, the Shifting Stone UA allows for you to have one unit that's stealth and very large, and means that it's very difficult for your opponent to be able to deal with them. You could, at the time, still do a double teleport. And for those who did not play Mark II, what that meant was there was no rule that said you couldn't be placed more than once, and you only ever lost your movement, so you could still make attacks, which would lead to some pretty crazy movement shenanigans. At one point, and we'll get to this, there was a brief time when the triple teleport was a factor, but we'll talk about that later. Theme forces in Mark II were a little bit different too. Each caster had a theme force. When a caster came out, a theme force came out for them. It had tiers, so often if you hear people still say tier list, that's why. You were limited to certain models, but then by taking certain things, you would meet different criteria. The more criteria you met, the more abilities you unlocked. So tiers 1 through 4. Tier 1 was just taking models in the theme, and then if you took specific things after that, you could unlock benefits. So, those will come up a lot more later on in Mark II, as we will find out. But right off the bat, we get the Warpwolf Stalker, and lists start to evolve around that. And as the edition goes on, we get Getorix, we get the Fulcrum, which doesn't get a lot of hoopla. The Gallows Grove is released at some point, and it was able to place a little bit farther than it is today, because a lot of placement effects in Mark II were within and not completely within. So the Strange Growth ability, which lets you place a Gallows Grove completely within 5 inches, actually would net you about 7.5 because it was a medium base. Being placed within 8 inches by Shifting Stones was huge, because what that did, if you had a large base, you were functionally getting about 10 inches out of a place, because you would go within 8 and it's almost 2 inches across the large base. So you go from front to back of your base, you're within 8, and you get an extra 2 inches of movement. And that was before any other shenanigans. So that was a factor. And in Mark II, so to talk about as we're evolving, so tournament lists at this time, Baldur 1's Theme Force got a little bit of attention early on. I didn't really see a lot. There was a little bit of Morvana 1 early, but she died off really quickly, as Purification was kind of a big deal in Mark II, and there were, and she really was hurt if she didn't have her upkeep spells. So we've got those things. Chromac 1 and Kruger 2 pretty early on emerge as the most common competitive casters. There was others, certainly. Kaya2 gets played. Kruger 1 was played a lot early. Cassius gets some attention as an off list a lot as the edition goes on. Trying to think of these early ones before we get to some of the later releases, because things change a lot. But I would say early on, a lot of it was the Chromac. There was no Chromac 2 yet. Chromac 1 and Kruger 2 show. Kruger 2 had a lot of answers to specific range problems. Chromac 1 was absolutely devastating to Crix, which has always been big. There's only about 1 year in this game where Crix hasn't been a big deal, and that year is now past. So, and it wasn't in Mark 2. Chromac with his Bestial spell and Warpath and the placement effects that I just referred to, accurate spells, and Lightning Strike on the Stalker. You can go. Sadly the thread is now missing, but there's a really long, big write up on what now Privateer Press employee Will Pagani created the Chromac 1 list. If you heard people talk about like the quintessential list for Circle, it was that Chromac 1 list. You would see a Stalker, you had 3 heavies and a Gorax, you had your 2 shifting stones, usually you had 2 units of Wold Stalkers, you had the Druid Wilder, and then and Swamp Gobbers, and usually like a Gallows Grove or 2, depending a little bit on how it worked. You would see it like Feral Stalker Getorix, you'd see Stalker Getorix, you'd see things like this. Basically, the idea being that with Warpath, you were able to go up, you could go 9 inches back, you could go up, you could move over. He was able to kill infantry with the Stalkers. You had Warbeast, which dealt with sufficiently with the amount of things that were hard to kill at that point. You could deal with them. Colossals hadn't quite yet come along when Chromac was doing pretty well, and so forth. So like that is, and that sort of starts the like Stalker. That I've made this post a bunch, but Mark II lists, especially at this time, I could tell you exactly the first 40% of the list, and that would be a Warpwolf Stalker, a Gorax, 2 units of shifting stones, and 1 would have an attachment. That was it. You could just begin a list that way. You just be like, I'm going to make a new Circle list. It might as well have had a template in it that said those models went in there. People tried, myself included, to explore other battle groups, other approaches, and frankly, like, you couldn't really compete with doing that. There was just no realm where that was the wrong thing to do, and there were a lot of realms where if you didn't do that, you were doing something wrong. Having access to Lightning Strike fundamentally changed everything that list could do. Having access to Primal changed your ability to go in for assassinations or to kill key targets. Those two things were massively important. And that stays true. Mark II, from beginning to end, once that was discovered, and that was a little bit before I even started playing, once that hits, there are some exceptions, but that battle, that 40% beginning of a list carries through the entirety of Mark II. Something, and I'm going to start, just to throw this out there, in the first episode I said this, but one of the purposes of this is to discuss how I feel about identity, right? And one of the things that I will say is that was a problem. Lists, the first 40% of your list feeling like there was no other competitively viable option other than to start that way is bad. That is not what you want as a game designer. That's not what I want as somebody who wants to have fun, cool, different things to play. There's a lot of really cool things about playing Warpwolf Stalkers, being able to put Lightning Strike on things. I get it. My Stalker saw a lot of table. My Gorax saw a lot of the table. I still play some of those today. They're different. But looking at a situation competitively and going, I didn't put a Stalker in this list. Did I do something wrong? Is not where I want the game to be. I don't think it's where Privateer Press ever wanted the game to be. I don't think it's a good place for the game to be. You may disagree with me. You're welcome to that. But in my opinion, not having the ability to have list diversity, and that first 40% of your list really, really hampers how people can approach playing the game, and in a way that is negative. So that's my piece on that. I just, throw that out there. So, but to get back on point, that was how the game, that's how Mark II began. Kruger 2 would have that battle group pretty frequently. You'd end up with, Kruger would end up with, Megalith, and sometimes with Megalith, he'd end up with a Warpwolf loadout. You'd have some guns in there, things like Blood Trackers, the Wold Stalkers. You'd see either of them. You'd see Druids in a lot of lists, with Chromac 1 being the exception. And there were kind of two schools of thought on this through most of the edition, frankly. There was the people who thought that Druids never did enough work for their points, because at that point, a full unit of them was basically another heavy, just to give some perspective. And they weren't that accurate. They didn't do that much damage and so forth. But what they did back then was two things different than now. So it's worth mentioning because they come up a lot in this discussion as well. But actually 3. So their clouds would stay when they died rather than go away. That'll be important later on as we go through Mark II. Their Force Bolts, they had Force Bolt, not Wind Strike, I think it's called now. So they could actually pull models closer. And the leader model had Counter Magic, which meant it was 3+ other living Druids, I think, was the way it worked. Enemy models couldn't cast spells while in that area, and enemy models couldn't cast spells if they were in that aura, and friendly models couldn't be targeted by enemy spells. That unit, in a lot of ways, made it so that we had really good matchups into a lot of what Crix did, because they're always debuffing, and we could put Druids in any unit, in any list, and nullify a lot of that, as well as having things like Chromac 1, which just had it built in. So you see Druids a lot, especially you start to see them with Kruger, so they would accentuate his scenario play. You would see Purebloods got the spray in Mark II, but they were generally sort of not really as respected as they are now. People didn't respect using the spray as much back then. Because of a lot of the hit and run that we were able to do with Stalkers, it was kind of like, well, I could do this with the Pureblood spray, but I could just as easily do it. And they didn't have Assault, which is a big factor. But I could just as easily send the Stalker and it could be Berserk with Wild Aggression and do more work in infantry than that spray would. It wasn't very accurate, and there weren't as many hard targets. So you would see it when you knew a list needed to deal with upkeeps like Arcane Shield from Signar, but it didn't get as much play as it does now, or as much attention as it does now even. And then, so those are that's where Mark II starts. And then as the edition evolves, Colossals come out. Kruger 2 takes a little bit of a backseat briefly, before re-emerging, and people realize that the speed penalty is pretty critical. Back then too, speed penalties did not allow you to charge if you're joining Mark III, and that's no longer the case. So Kruger's feat was much, much more powerful back then, because if you feeded on your whole army, you could slowly run back to the zone, but that was about it. So we see Kruger 2 and Chromac 1 as the edition begins. Then we get the release of... Then we get, if you want to talk about the anti-Circle people, we get Circle Christmas Begins, if you will, and we get Morvana 2. And Morvana 2 does a lot of what Morvana 1 did, in that she still is attrition focused, she's more infantry minded, she wants to cast spells. These are all things Morvana 1 did and does. She does it in different ways, but still holds that theme. And importantly, she has a rule that allows her to... there was a lot of damage and health and healing that Morvana 1 did. Morvana 2 does even more of that. Prominently, she has an ability that allows you to take D3 damage for a friendly faction model to be able to re-roll an attack or damage roll. And now Circle changes at this point. Morvana 2 was largely considered... at one point, people were debating if she was the best thing in the game. I personally don't think she was, but she was certainly top 10 for a while. And lists evolve again a little bit. She actually wants to play a lot of infantry. People have a lot of success playing a lot of infantry. I would still say the most common battle group with her from then until the end actually still was Warpwolf Stalker, Gorax, and there's usually at least one unit of Shifting Stones. Those things become popular. You see some variations on the list. That there was a Woldrath version of the list that was quite good. Reeves of Orboros are played pretty much with her and only with her throughout the edition, because she was the only one that allowed them to reliably hit their attacks, and they had to waterfall back then. They didn't just get 2 shots. Skinwalker, the Skinwalker unit attachment comes out right around now as well, and giving them extra attacks and making them very difficult to kill. And so we see her usually playing with them. We see the medium base infantry because their feet would bring them all back, things like that. So now all of a sudden, and the Gallows Groves allowed her some pretty interesting assassination shenanigans and turning off tough and things. So then we sort of entered the Morvana 2 phase, where she was considered the best. You had to play her. This is around the time, I would say, you would see Morvana 2 with Chromac 1 some, you would see her with Kruger 2 some, you'd see a few other things. But Morvana 2 was largely the pair pretty frequently. She didn't want to play into Crix generally, though, because a lot of her things keyed off of living models. And so that's why you'd still see Chromac, or whatever you were playing with her was needed to play into Crix. And that sort of is a phase that Circle lives in for a while, is the Morvana 2 phase. She's busted, and some people played her from then until the rest of the edition. A lot of different builds. She was sort of the, like, Denegra 1 of Circle, where she would, like, some of the things that were maybe considered mediocre might shine with her, might be fantastic with her. Warwolves and Reeves see their first times on the table, for example. Bloodpack see their kind of only time that they've ever shined. Blood Trackers, of course, good with her. Anyways, there's a whole slew of different things that were present for her, but we enter that phase. So again, just an evolution, stuff to keep in mind, and we're about halfway into the edition when this happens. She's a pretty big deal. Then, year and a half after that, probably, is when Bradigus is released. And this is Circle Christmas continues, and this is a huge fundamental shift for Circle. All of a sudden, this is the first time in the entire edition that we saw Wolds. We basically see Wold Guardians and Wold Watchers en masse with Bradigus. His theme allows you to get a free model, which was kind of a big bonus back then. His theme allows you to bring extra Sentry Stones and extra Shifting Stones. And so now this is sort of the first, like, forest line of sight block wall thing that we're able to generate. And because you're able to bring 3 Sentry Stones and 3 Shifting Stones, you can block huge amounts of the table because of how those models function at the time. You could set up a wall of forests that was like pretty easily. You could do 18 inches of line of sight blocking. You usually didn't even need that much. And that's before we start talking about the fact that you could bring 3 Shifting Stones. Now, on one side, that was really good because obviously placing is good because they're slow Wolds. But also, and the Fury management is good because you've got a bunch of Wolds. And they primal and things like that. And the Wilder and a few other things that would help you with your Fury. But you could still do double teleports this time. So this was like one of the first, like, absolutely necessary erratas that hit Circle. And that was because you could place a triangle with a stone in the triangle so that you could basically you could teleport 1 stone with your triangle to another location so that it was still in formation, and then you could basically, so you'd like make a bigger triangle and you use 1 stone to go into the new triangle of the second that was created by the third, and then place, and you had something like an absurd like 40 inches of the table you could cover by turn 2. it was busted. The fix is still in place today, which was you can only be placed by shifting zones once. Bredigus sees a little decline, but not really. He's one of those lists from then on that becomes a problem, but he's very unique. You don't see anything else. You do see some Baldur too, played throughout, mostly by a guy named Walter. He was the most successful with it, just as a list that could basically tank and bore the opponent into you winning. Which is still kind of what Baldur does, which is fine. So Bradigus exists, and he kind of sticks around for most of the edition. He's not always the most commonly played after a little while, but that's a big part of what Circle's identity was. Around the same time, or a little bit after Bradigus and before the next Warlock is released, we get Una 1, we get the Rotterhorn Griffin, and the Rotterhorn Griffin has an animus called Acceleration, and we're now about 4+ years into Mark II. And that model at the time has an animus called Acceleration, which allows you to do a special action at the end of your activation. So things like Black-Clad Wayfarers can walk up, spray, and then still phase jump back to safety. And that ends up being a big part of Kruger 2 lists going forward, because now you can use a pair of Black-Clads to basically kill the world, kill every infantry model you want to. Una has Bird's Eye, so she's able to use, and Black Penny, so she's able to use her gun to keep things cleared off of your important models. You've got these usually two Rotterhorns that can be primaled, and they have open fists, and so they can actually still contribute a bit of work. They themselves still have a version of the Shriek that they have today, but it's boostable, so again, they're able to really do work in infantry when they need to. And then you've backed that up with, you know, the standard other battle group that I've mentioned, things like Megalith, Stalker, Gorax, sometimes a Feral. I played a battle engine, but most people didn't. Things like that. And so that's another place. And I bring that one up because a lot of people mention Acceleration. And I think this is an important time to, pardon me, make another aside in that. And we're probably going to come back and investigate these in, you know, holistically. But a lot of people mention Acceleration as part of identity when I was asking people what they were really looking at. And I find that really interesting. So if you watch both videos up to this point, that was released in May of 2014. I double checked. And they took a little while to catch on, but not very long. And the game Horde's released in 0506. So now we're talking about 8 years of Circle before this model existed. And it comes up as identity. My opinion on that is it was a really cool rule. I think it really fit with Circle, but I think that calling something that came out that late critical to our identity is perhaps a bit misguided. I think that for something to be identity, it just has to fit within the whole, right? And it did shape those last 2 years. A lot of the lists relied on doing a lot of really cool stuff with that model. And I did think that rule was really cool. I had a ton of fun with it. It was very Circle, right? It was something that you had to think about how you were going to apply it. You had to use it at the right time. You had to use it with the right models. It mattered at list building. It mattered at the table. It was a really cool rule. It contributed to our identity, certainly. It did not define our identity. I would argue that the sprint on the Warpwolf Stalker defined our identity. Primal has defined our identity. Shifting Stones at the time I did, because those things were so ubiquitous for so much of the game. This was a specific package that worked in a specific way that contributed to adding to the feel of what it was to play against a Circle player. It was good, and I liked it. But by itself, I don't believe that was enough to be identity. Anyways, the edition continues on. Eventually, Chromac 2 comes out. He's kind of very different from things. But he does really enable our War Beasts still. So he's another model that's really just contributing even more to the play Druids, play Stalkers, play your Beasts ideal that the faction has. He's really good into Trolls, so he sees a lot of play. Anyway, so that is basically our journey through Mark II, and this was pretty lengthy actually for one of these episodes. But that's how we go from Mark I, we go into Mark II, and that's kind of what I saw in Mark II. Those are the things that were played. At the end, you could sort of summarize. You saw a lot of Stalkers, you saw a lot of Sprint, you saw there was a lot of our catalog that was not played. So That's going to be important as we look at Mark III, and a lot of people talk about models that aren't seen as competitive now and not played, and I want to highlight that that's been true as we've gone along everywhere. I also want to highlight how some of these things weren't good, right? I talked about that before, like building your list and going, I'm going to go Stones, Gorax, Stalker just before I even do anything. No, I don't think that's I don't think that's a healthy place for a faction to be. You saw that break down a little bit with Morvana too. You saw that break down significantly with Bradigus. Bradigus, actually, a lot of people came to Circle because they were told how overpowered it was. Some point around the Bradigus time frame, I would say, is when people started seeing lists and would just like buy into a faction because they got the latest strong thing. And I would say some of that's actually died off with Mark III, and I think that's also good for just my personal opinion. So, anyways, that's our journey through Mark II. We're still going to have some episodes where we look at what Privateer has said, and then we start really looking more in depth at Mark III. But for now, like I said, we're going to keep going with this series. We'll probably inject some other things, or I may inject some other things. We may just try to knock this out. But as always, thank you for watching. If you like the show, be sure to hit me up on social media. Don't forget, we have a Discord and a Facebook group, so feel free to throw out any questions on there, or if you had any feedback for that, you can throw them on the episode as well. If you liked what you heard, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes, and also be sure to share us on any social media you'd like. If you have any questions for me, let me know, and thanks again for watching.